Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session of the ADA Forum. My name is Ben Rice. I'm the Executive Officer of the Australian Digital Alliance, and I'd like to begin the session today by acknowledging the Ngunnawal people, the traditional owners of the land on which I'm joining you today. On behalf of everyone at the ADA, I pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. We're going to jump straight into it today because we've got lots of panelists here to talk about open access and the growing trend towards institutions moving towards an open access model. So I'm going to start by introducing Robin Wright, who is going to be the host of the session today. Robin is about to join us and is the co-lead of Creative Commons Australia chapter. And there she is, Robin. Thanks very much.
Hi, Ben. Thanks very much. First, I would also like to respectfully acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and their elders past and present, who are the traditional owners of the land on which Swinburne's Australian campuses are located and where I'm speaking from today. So welcome, everyone. As Ben said, in this session, we're looking at open access and also COVID-19 as a catalyst for open access and the growing trend towards open access in research and academia, both in Australia and internationally. So the idea of providing open access to academic research began its development in the earliest days of the internet. Back in the early 2000s, soon after the digital agenda reforms here in Australia and the DMCA in the USA and the two international WIPO copyright treaties in 1996, the development of these new digital technologies and the internet created a vision of the potential for worldwide access to and dissemination of knowledge. The conference, which produced the Budapest Open Access Initiative in 2002, spoke about free online scholarship and proclaimed an old tradition and a new technology have converged to make possible an unprecedented public good. The old tradition is the willingness of scientists and scholars to publish the fruits of their research in scholarly journals without payment for the sake of inquiry and knowledge. The new technology is the internet. The public good they make possible is the worldwide electronic distribution of the peer-reviewed journal literature and completely free and unrestricted access to it by all scientists, scholars, teachers, students, and other curious minds. So they wanted to remove barriers to access and to lay the foundation for uniting humanity in a common intellectual conversation and quest for knowledge. And now, here we are, 20 years after this almost, and dealing with a pandemic which has reminded us how important it is for humanity to have the broadest possible access to research outputs. But we're still trying to sort out the interaction between the requirements of scholarly communication, research funding, and the commercial academic publishing model in the digital world. Transformative agreements are providing a pathway to full open access to academic publications, and many publishers are publishing fully open access and hybrid journals. So it'll be exciting today to hear from CSIRO Publishing about what they're doing in this area. And it's also great to have Open Access Australasia here to talk about their role. Recent moves by funding bodies, such as, of course, Plan S in Europe and the current consultation by the NH and MRC here in Australia, to ensure that publicly funded research is made immediately available as open access and licensed for reuse via a Creative Commons license, are having a significant impact in the academic environment at the moment. So I'm very pleased to have the opportunity today to moderate the panel discussion with our esteemed panel members. And I'd like to introduce Ginny Barber, who is the Director of Open Access Australasia, Martin Borchert, who is Chair of Open Access Australasia's Executive Committee and also the University Librarian at the University of New South Wales, Cynthia Love, who is the Executive Manager, Information Services at CSIRO, and Andrew Stammer, Director of CSIRO Publishing. So thank you everyone for joining us here today. So a lot of the attendees here today will have seen the pre-recorded video provided by Ginny and Martin. So I thought that we'd start first by asking Andrew to fill us in on the approach to open access at the CSIRO and CSIRO Publishing, and starting to tell us a little bit about why CSIRO and CSIRO Publishing decided to move to open access. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, Robin. Good afternoon, everyone. If I could start by perhaps explaining a little bit about the relationship between CSIRO Publishing and the broader CSIRO. CSIRO, as you'd be aware, is the nation's government-owned research agency. It's a greater than a $1 billion organisation, so the size of a large university, around about 5,500 employees, and there of which over 3,000 are researchers. The rest of us are either support services people, and then there are some business units within the organisation that actually operate on a commercial basis. One of those is CSIRO Publishing. In a legal sense, we are exactly the same as CSIRO. Our ABN is the same as the organisation. Our terms and conditions are the same, but we have been instructed as CSIRO Publishing to operate on a commercial basis because the organisation does not wish to divert funds away from research. So we go out there and we sell publishing products and publishing services. I'll pass to Cynthia in just a moment to comment on her role with the with CSIRO. But overall, a little bit of information about CSIRO Publishing. We're around about a $9 million business. We're very similar to a university press. We have scholarly journals that we sell. They comprise some that CSIRO owns and some that we publish on behalf of learned societies, who are an important stakeholder in this space. We also publish books and magazines, and we have writer training services as well. And if you're interested to pursue any of those with us, you're welcome to get in touch with me at a later date. That's kind of the advertisement. So I'm going to field to Cynthia to talk about the library services, and then she'll also fill you in a little bit about how CSIRO has, with its various stakeholders within the organisation, come to a position on open access. So Cynthia, over to you.
Thanks, Andrew. Library services is within my portfolio in CSIRO, and funnily enough, we operate like just about every other research library, and that is we purchase material to inform the science or the research and the business of the organisation. What we have done and will continue to do is start changing that to move it from not just purchasing information to inform the research and business of CSIRO, but to actually change the business model so that we're actually paying to disseminate our own publications much more widely. And the reason why the organisation has gone down this path is that we're a publicly funded research agency. We are the largest science research agency in Australia, and we feel it is our obligation to make our science as widely available as we can, not just to the taxpayers of this country, but also internationally. We operate in a global environment, and making our research available freely is to everybody's advantage.
Thank you, Cynthia. So, Andrew, I understand that the CSIRO is looking at moving into a new transformative read and publish agreement. Could you tell us how that will work for institutions and authors?
So, happy to do that. If I take it sort of as an historical perspective, we compete, of course, with all the other publishers in the world for content and for subscription dollars. And towards the end of 2018, there was the announcement from Wiley in Germany about the deal that they had done with the German funding agencies to create a read and publish deal in which German funded scholarly content that was placed with Wiley for publication would be published as open access. And there was a significant lump sum of money that went to Wiley for that. That for us was a major catalyst in thinking about our role in the system and how we could move towards open access. We did have a number of open access journals already, and the funding model behind those was one of sponsorship from the partners that we were working with. So they stumped up the money for the publishing costs. Our own journals were essentially hybrid journals, so subscription with the option for an individual author to pay a publications fee, an APC as they call them, article processing charge or author publication charge. And then that individual article would be made open access. And quite a few people take us up on that. But the read and publish mechanism gave us a way forward to, in a wholesale way, make an entire journal or get it on a path towards open access. Now, when these things were announced, we knew very little about them. And so we did a little bit of research, and I happened to be at a panel not unlike this one in North Sydney. And my co-panelists were Ginny Barber and Martin Borchert. And over a cup of coffee during one of the breaks, I'd said to Martin, "Oh, we don't know much about these read and publish deals." And I think I recall correctly in him saying, "No, I don't either. Why don't we have a chat and see if we can work something out together?" And I must say at this point that I'm very grateful to Martin for putting up with our stumbling and bumbling around trying to work out how these things could work. But together we had a series of conversations, and my legal people drafted up a draft agreement, and we were able to get to a place where for the beginning of 2020, we had something in place. I, of course, shared this with my beloved colleague, Cynthia, and she said, "I want one of them too." And so I worked very hard with her team, and hats off to Tom Girk in that group, who did a terrific job negotiating a read and publish deal there. There was recognition on both sides of those negotiations that this was completely new, that there wasn't a go-to space to discover how this, what the answers were. We'd got to work this out ourselves. And it was the openness of the dialogue, I think, that really enthused me the most in getting to a place where there was recognition on both sides that we needed a revenue source in order to do the work we do and add the value to the scientific record as part of the publishing process. There was a recognition on our side that Martin and CSIRO through Cynthia and Tom wanted the openness in the process, and we were able to get to a place where we have an agreement. We then took that draft agreement, and through some introductions also facilitated by Martin, had a conversation with CAUL, the Council of Australian University Librarians, and they expressed deep interest in pursuing things. I think they were a little suspicious at first about our bona fides, and the conversation opened between myself and the CAUL executive, and I was able to bring in our then chief scientist, Kathy Foley, who has gone on now to be the Australian chief scientist, and she met with CAUL as well. And I think that gave them the assurance that CSIRO, as a large organization, was interested in this space, as well as just CSIRO Publishing. I was concerned that if Wiley came into this country and got a deal through CAUL, that we would see content flow away from us to other publishers, specifically to Wiley. So that was why we were keen to move very quickly. In the conversations with Tom and Cynthia, we realized that CSIRO is at once a producer of scholarly content. Our researchers write papers. We are a consumer of it. Cynthia's team purchase this content from around the world, or curate content from around the world where it doesn't need to be purchased. And we're a publisher. And so we had to resolve all these clashes and differences within our own organization. And in a sense, we're just a microcosm of the larger scholarly enterprise on an international basis. It was a lot easier to agree with ourselves, although in CSIRO that's not always the case. But in this instance, we were able to get there, and we've been able to take it out further. And we now have 25 of these agreements with universities around the country, including, I might add, Swinburne. So get writing, Robin.
Absolutely.
So just to sort of give you that picture from the other side of the fence in CSIRO, how we actually came to doing it was that I met with Sue McKerricker, who's the executive director of ALIA, and she said, "Oh, what are you guys doing about this?" And I thought, "Oh, I haven't been paying attention. I better get into it and find out what's going on." And spoke to Tom Gerg, who is in charge of acquisitions in CSIRO, and it happened very quickly. One of the things that we did to start this was actually come up with an open access position for the organisation, and that we originally, Tom and I originally drafted it, and then that's where we had to do this negotiation about, as Andrew was referring to, around the fact, well, it's all very well for us to have a position, but Andrew's got a position too, and both of us represent the organisation. And so CSIRO had to have an open access position as a producer, as a consumer, as a publisher. And that position is now actually up on our public website. We have then proceeded to a path to implementation, which is that as our contracts with our publishers come up for renewal, we will be negotiating transformative agreements. And that will happen over a 3-year period. And to date, we've actually got 8 contracts with the different publishers, one of which is Elsevier. So we cut our teeth on Andrew, so to speak, and then we went straight into Elsevier.
That's great. Martin, I wonder if you would like to talk about that process and what it was felt like from your end.
Yes, hello everybody. I'd be really happy to. I was really happy actually to bump into Andrew at that conference, and it was a wonderful opportunity to get the conversation started. From my point of view, it was always about, I think, doing work that we could use across the whole sector through the great work that CALL does, but also just, using UNSW and our expertise to work through all those issues. And we did have also quite a few people involved, so I'd just like to acknowledge all of their work or bringing their expertise. And we had many meetings, in fact, to talk about it over what was quite a lengthy period of a few months. So. And I was really pleased, I think that UNSW had like to know the second transformative agreement, I think with CSIRO Publishing after CSIRO. And I was really pleased to see that you're able to work with CALL on a deal that, worked for a large number of institutions as well. From my university's perspective, we've been doing a lot of work around open access, and it's my belief that we need to give all the models a go and try to learn about everything that's happening. It would be my opinion that, to use just one model only won't get us through the change as quickly as if we tried to use all the different models. So in that regard, we're working with CALL, we're reviewing all the transformative agreements that they're putting out. Last year and this year are difficult for us in a budget way, so we're not able to spend a lot more. We're really looking for value, but we're also looking for the principles that align to our university. And one of the things we're interested in also is that agreements allow us to put the item into our repository, and that the publisher actually helps us also to do that in a systematized way. Because in a large institution like this, if we need to do all the deposits manually, with every publisher and every output, it won't work. So we need to systematize it. So that's been one of our goals. So we haven't jumped at every opportunity immediately for those various reasons, but I certainly think that we're going to see an acceleration.
Yeah. I wonder if you're talking about giving all the models a go, but I was wondered whether the complexities of the different models and different versions and platforms make it difficult for authors and researchers to understand how it works and to navigate their options around open access. Does anyone have any thoughts about that?
If I could step in there, Robin. As we've announced these agreements, we've had feedback from people who have been our authors for a very long time, and they are delighted that their institutions have signed up for these arrangements. And they are now submitting content to us, and it is getting published OA under these arrangements. The deals at the moment with Martin and with Cynthia are 2-year deals, but the call deals are all only 1 year. And I understand why call wanted 1-year deals. And that was because we are going through a very difficult time at the moment in the university sector. And there's a serious reluctance to commit to significant budgetary expenditure for the long term. However, we are already getting authors come to us and say, if I submit my paper now, will it be accepted in time and published in time if this is a 1-year deal, or am I going to get caught because the deal ends at the end of 2021? And so we will be sharing that information with Call. And what I'd like to see is that we can come to an arrangement whereby these agreements are long-term, 3-5 years, but with the potential to renegotiate the cost on a year-by-year basis. A commitment to the deal, but maybe there's some wriggle room around the dollars. But the feedback, as I say at the moment, is the researchers themselves don't want to get caught out heading down at one track, having submitted a paper to a journal, and then find that the read and publish, the offer of OA covered, costs covered by their institution suddenly expires. So I think that's something I hadn't foreseen, but it's clearly an issue and one that we need to deal with.
Yes, I wonder, Ginny, if you'd like to say anything about how libraries can help authors understanding this new system around these new agreements.
Yeah, I think that one thing I think that we've found is that we need an environment that makes open access the default, easy to comply with rather than hard. And, as Martin said, I think one route to that will be having a diversity of options that researchers can turn to. Obviously, researchers are very fond of their current journals quite often, and so they want to be able to publish in them. And so that's where transformative agreements, I think, are incredibly important. But at the same time, we also want to encourage experimentation. And, it's not just the open access landscape that's changing dramatically. I mean, the publishing landscape is changing dramatically. Just as, for example, during the COVID pandemic, the biggest increase in publishing was through preprints. There's absolutely no question that was a sort of game changer in the whole sharing of information around the time of an emergency. And whether or not you kind of agree with them or support them, the fact is they were massively important, and they have changed the way that I think that many researchers will publish forever, because we're seeing people publishing there not just on COVID related issues now. And it's also another example of what researchers want to do is to do what's easy for them. So why is it easy to put, why are so many preprints published? Because it's really, really easy. And I think that's a really strong lesson that university libraries in particular, and universities need to understand, is that academic are quite unwilling to jump through hoops. They want to have the process made as simple as possible. And I think it's part of our responsibility is to build the infrastructure in place that makes openness kind of the easy thing to do.
I agree with you, Ginny, but I think preprints have probably done their duty in terms of being the catalyst for open access. Now, I think we should be moving much more towards open access being of the published record and not the manuscript, because there are changes between a manuscript and the published record. And I think that with the cooperation of publishers, we can do what Martin's looking to do, which is systematise the availability of these and actually have arrangements where we can download the details and the DOIs and things like that from publishers straight into our repositories. And so that, you know, my organisation, for example, has this repository, which is our, you know, record of all of our publication with the link straight through to the published record, not a manuscript.
Martin, did you have a comment about that?
I did. When we talk about, you know, like open access with our authors, you know, there is a complexity to it with different models, but to me, it's not that OA is complex. I think it's more to do with that the institution has hundreds of contracts and they're all different, and that's what makes it complex. So what we're seeing is, you know, libraries would manage all the subscriptions, it would all be behind the scenes, and authors weren't that interested in that, and they didn't have to be. But now moving into open access and in transformative agreements, you see, they're interested in it because it affects them. And so they start to see some of the complexity. So when I talk about the different models, you know, I think it's a publisher thing, but you know, there are also some models that are going to work better for different institutions. And what I also meant, you know, was sort of reference to the green and gold models. And I'm actually really glad that we've kept our repositories going, because in some ways, you know, it provides a catch-all for where we don't have a transformative agreement. It helps to put, you know, also it gives the alternative. It means if we don't have agreement that we have a BATNA. So, you know, also it'll help us also with, I think, with making the data available that we want to. So our repositories still really important.
Yes, Ginny, did you want to say something?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really fascinating conversation, this about, you know, what we're talking about when we're talking about openness. And I just like to expand a little bit on, you know, kind of the concept of different models of openness. So, for example, we talk about open access to research publications. The global conversations that are happening right now around open research more generally, open science more generally, which includes open data. It also includes open research practices throughout the life cycle. So you know, for the record, you probably guessed I'm a bit of a fan of preprints. I'm actually involved with medRxiv, providing some advice to them. And I think that we are going to see researchers want to be able to make things open throughout the life cycle. And absolutely, there is a very important role for the final published record, the final published version, but increasingly what we're seeing is researchers are experimenting with different routes. And so that, I think, is what we're also going to see when the conversation that's happening right now is around the UNESCO consultations on open science. They are actively supporting multiple models of openness, which are not just exclusive to the final published record. So I think what we're going to have to be open to is is trying to support as many of those as are appropriate for our researchers.
But it does, of course, increase the complexity of the overall environment. I wanted to ask also if someone, and I noticed a question I think has come up through the chat as well about the rights retention strategy and how authors feel about retaining rights and the impact of this on institutions as well as the individual authors. Has anyone got any thoughts about that?
I can talk a little bit. Yeah, I can talk a little bit about it. So this has been primarily come from, initially come from Plan S, although it's of course not new actually, because Harvard, for example, has had a policy of rights retention for many years now, and there's more than 100 institutions globally that have a similar policy. This is one of the core components of Plan S's route to open access. So one is open access to the final published version, and the second route is open access through rights retention of to the author accepted manuscript. Currently, they are supporting both of them because right now we don't have open access options for all publishers, and it's going to be a time before we move towards that. And as many people probably know, the NHMRC has a consultation out, and that is one of the routes that they're also proposing. So I think that there are structures to be put in place to make that happen, but I think at least for the foreseeable future, that's going to be an important route for open access.
Andrew, did you want to say something about that?
Thanks. The CSIRO has a rights retention strategy of its own, I guess, in that when you sign up to work for CSIRO, anything that you produce in the course of your work belongs to the organization. Now, this is different to a lot of the university sector where there's a sense of the academic freedom. The individual owns the rights. In our case, CSIRO owns it, including anything that I write or any slides I create, or I suppose as the words are spilling out of my mouth now, it belongs to CSIRO. So that's a starting point. I struggle with the concept of calling it a rights retention strategy when the requirement under Plan S is to apply a CC BY license on it that then promptly gives away all those rights to everybody else. I find that curious. I can see why they've done it, and I think the principal purpose seems to me to be to support a green open access model. For publishers, that's very difficult, because it undermines the subscription model. I get Plan S is trying to drive subscriptions out of the way, but I think it ends up creating a lot of duplication of content, and some of it not in the final form where it's linked to all the references and linked to the data, so all the value add that happens through a publisher's production processes, including copy editing also. And if you saw some of the stuff that comes in here, a lot of those papers need some serious copy editing, and not least help for folks whose first language is not English as well. So I feel with the green strategies, they are reliant on another business model to sustain them. I think it's been a mistake in the whole push for open access to conflate open with free, because if you want a curated, peer-reviewed, quality-controlled, interconnected system that's properly archived, there's a lot of work involved in that, and that work needs to be paid for. So what I like about the gold models is that there is a sensible financial underpinning that will allow the system to preserve the scientific record in a suitably accurate format, and without necessarily duplicating other versions of papers that can lead to confusion. And certainly in the case of the preprints, we've seen some materials that were inappropriate and picked up by some of the nastier parts of the media and promoted without the value of the peer review to filter the material out. There was a Nobel laureate from 1978 whose name escapes me at the moment. Can't remember, but anyway, he made the observation that in an environment where there's a plethora of information, you get a dearth of attention. And I feel that with the value add of the publishing process as it's gone, it allows researchers to recognize brand names and identify that it is worth my time to spend on this particular paper because I see it is branded as Nature or PNAS or CSIRO Publishing even, whereas they don't have that surety with some of the other channels that they can get at the content. So I'm very keen to see that the scientific record is properly preserved for the next 350 years as well.
Ginny, did you want to respond to that?
Oh, I'd love to. Yes, I think, to be honest, we've been having these conversations for 20 years, and I've been involved in the open access movement for a long time, as have many others in this kind of chat, and others I see in the attendees, and I feel like we're having the same conversations time and time again. Open access is not the preserve just of publishers. We need to be thinking about open research more widely across the discipline. The reason why it's taken 20 years, and to be honest, the COVID pandemic to really change a funder's, the NHMRC's mind on this, as they explicitly have said in their targeted consultation, is the moral imperative shown to us by the COVID-19 pandemic for the need for things to be open. And if we'd had publishers 20 years ago supporting many of the initiatives, we would not be having to kind of have these sort of relitigate these arguments. So I've worked in very selective journals. I worked at The Lancet, I've worked at PLOS Medicine. I completely understand and support the need for peer review, but I also feel like we need to support experimentation. And if you look, for example, the most successful example of open access globally is in Latin America, where they have a nationally supported, very diverse ecosystem, which is not reliant on commercial publishing, and they have the highest rates of open access in the world. And I would love us to see within Australia a system which replicates that and has kind of good investment within the entire ecosystem. So we're not reliant on just publishers having to, sort of do the right thing and to balance the books for open access to happen.
Yeah, that's interesting, Ginny, because I was interested to ask people about there's been criticisms about how open access will actually affect the non-commercial open access publishing system that exists in Latin America, and whether this is something that we need to consider as we develop our own open access system to think about the relationship with the Global South.
Yeah, I think there's a huge amount to be learned from the Global South. And in fact, again, one of the pillars of the UNESCO discussion document, which thanks for popping it in the chat there. I would note that anyone can join that chat. So if you're really interested to see how this kind of plays out globally, it's going to play out over the next few nights in discussions between countries. But one of the things they've talked about in that is South-South learning. I think we have this model that we only have one model that works for North America or Europe or Australia, and that's kind of projecting that onto the rest of the world. And it clearly isn't going to work for the rest of the world. And as you say, the people who are in South Africa are extremely worried that imposing an APC model of publishing will actually destroy the current system they have. And it's a legitimate concern, I think.
Yes. Now, I think Ben would like to bring some questions in from the chat if possible. Is that appropriate, Ben?
Certainly, yeah. So plenty of questions coming in already, and would encourage everyone to keep asking them in the chat, or please use the raise hand function, and we'll prompt you to turn your microphone on, and you can ask a question verbally as well. So one of the questions that's come in here is research funding seems to be a major driver of mandating open access of scholarly journal articles, and it's getting a lot of attention at the Commonwealth level. But what is being done, and what role does state and territory government research funding play in that?
Maybe I can just jump in with one particular point, which is that I think that we run the risk, if we rely on states to do individual work, that we won't get a nationally coordinated approach. I think one of the problems, I'm from the UK, you can hear, I mean, one of the problems I think we have within Australia is that if we don't have a national approach overall, we may not be able to sort of transition as quickly as we'd like. CSIRO is a great example, and CSIRO Publishing is a great example of a national asset that has clearly got the overall aims of the good of the country in its mind. And I think if we see individual states going their own way, there is a bit of a risk that we may not see that joined up. At the same time, we really do struggle because there's so much money currently paid for subscription at the individual state level, and that's really hard to capture, and it's likely that a lot of that money is being duplicated on subscription funding, and we'd be much more efficient if we were to coordinate that.
Does Andrew or anyone else have any comments on that?
We get content from the state departments of agriculture and similar, and some of the other NGO agencies, and some of them have signed up to read and publish deals through their connections with Call with us. So they're looking for the publishing service. I don't disagree with Jenny in terms of seeking experimentation. I do think that first agreement that Wiley brokered in Germany with RNP was a major catalyst in shifting the environment. And I think that's been really important, because publishers can easily see that, okay, here's a mechanism for us to, many of us as publishers just see open access as a business model. How is it going to work in such a way that we can afford to provide the services and there's some money left over at the end? How much money is left over at the end? I think there's another set of arguments there, and we're seeing that start to play through in questions around patents and vaccines at the moment. And I think it's a very important discussion that has to be had. But I think we shouldn't avoid the fact that a lot of the other mechanisms require funding as well in order to create something that is useful. So perhaps to pick up on that south to south learning, understanding what goes on in South America and how they've actually funded their open access models, and are they, is the funding adequate, and how do you ensure that it sustains? I think would be a really useful thing to understand.
Thank you, Ben. Are there any other questions from the chat?
Yeah, we've got a couple of more coming in. So one of the questions here is, can you see an alternative to using metrics to evaluate researchers and for granting research funds?
Martin, do you have an opinion on that?
It's a complex one. I'll call on others to comment as well, but I think in the open world, you really want to have opportunity to go with the value of the article rather than, perhaps the journal itself, or a combination of both. I'm personally a believer in that diversity of models is very helpful, because with diversity you get innovation. Without the diversity, we won't have innovation for new models that we don't have existing yet. I think we can maybe do some more work around reward and recognition, incentives, which is around the attention given to articles and not so much the ranking of the journals that they're in. I think you really want to have a much wider sort of view of what the impact is of articles, either working through research groups and communities, or to governments, or to individuals as well.
I'm looking at this question thinking it's moved a bit away from open access into actual straight out evaluation of researchers and research. And certainly in CSIRO, we're moving much more down the line towards measuring the impact of the research, not just the publication, and not just the impact of the publication or the publication rate of the researcher, but the actual impact of the research itself, which is a whole different topic.
Do you think that interacts with open access, though, in relation to increased citation rates?
It increases the availability and then potentially the impact. Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry. Go on, you go, Jenny.
Yeah, no, I was just going to jump in to say that I do think they are. There's a kind of whole web of things that are linked together, and there's no question that right at the beginning, for example, of the open access publishing, a lot of it was held back because researchers were very tied to publishing in specific journals, and the impact factor was something that still did then and still does drive decisions around publishing, and new and emerging journals take a while to get an impact factor, and so it's very hard to compete with the current models. but so saying, we do have options to reward other things. So as what, you know, as Cynthia said, you know, we know that you get more citations from open access, but again, you know, what about if we rewarded data sharing, or if we rewarded code sharing? That kind of thing can play into being more open more generally.
Okay, Ben, have we got any other questions?
Yes, so another one that's come in here. How does the federal government's view impact on open access and open research? And is there more advocacy in this space that's required?
So I can comment from a CSIRO perspective. We have a letter of expectations from our minister, and we've gone through a few recently. That letter, the current letter indicates an expectation that CSIRO will support open access, but it also recognises it specifically recognises the existence of CSIRO Publishing, for which I was very grateful, and that we operate on a commercial model. Now, that commercial model can support OA, and I'm really thrilled that these R&P deals, because they are able to do that. But so there is a general expectation from our minister that we will head in the direction of open, but recognising also there's a lot of complexity. And indeed, a lot of CSIRO's published outputs that don't go through journals. They go through other mechanisms, reports. Some of them don't see the light of day because there's private sector money has gone into them. Somebody's paid for some research to be done, and they want to get the benefits of that research for their commercial enterprise ahead of their competitors. And so that doesn't come to public light, although most of our agreements would allow some sort of publication to come out, a public publication to come out. I've lost my thread, sorry. I'll leave it at that.
But the expectation is, I'll pick up for you, Andrew.
Thanks.
The expectation is that we do make it available, and not just the publication, the data supporting the publication. But as Andrew said, we are an applied research organisation. The I in CSIRO stands for industrial, and there are occasions where the research is done under license, under contract, sorry, which may mean that it is either embargoed or restricted at times. So we operate in a complex environment, and I wouldn't be so arrogant as to think a university doesn't too. Of course, we all have different types of research we do, but where possible, it's open. There's a wonderful saying that comes out of the OECD about data, and I think it applies across the board to information as well, which is as open as possible and closed as necessary.
Thank you. Ginny, did you have something to say?
Yeah, I was just going to quickly comment on some work that both the Open Access Australasia and CORE have been doing over the past year on exactly this, of lobbying to governments. So one of the approaches that we think is probably most valuable to try and think about is having a national approach to open research more generally, so not just open access but all the other components of it. And last year we did some workshops, and we did some webinars which are available on our website, which both looked at it from the Australian perspective, and we had Cathy Foley when she was currently Chief Scientist of CSIRO, but obviously now she's the Australian Chief Scientist, and we had a group of people from various countries that have implemented national open research strategies, so Finland, Malaysia and Ireland. And I think that it's not so much the lobbying that's required, it's providing a model that actually works for your country is really important. And one of the key things within that is finding your champion within government or at that equivalent level. So we're really delighted that Cathy Foley is now saying that open access is one of her highest priorities. And I think that does indicate that we have an opportunity to influence across government more generally.
And possibly that lack of understanding is what has held things back in the past. There's really good, clear understanding in government about how open access operates, and that'll be really valuable. Sorry, Ben.
I'd just add from the ADA's perspective as well, we're really supportive of the work that Open Access Australasia has been doing and will continue to do. And we recently made a submission to the Department of Education's consultation on university research commercialisation. And one of our points in that was exactly, as Jenny has said, supporting the chief scientists' support of a move towards more open access research as well. Couple of more questions. We've got just under 10 minutes, so please everyone do take the opportunity to jump in with anything that you have. One question here that goes back to earlier in the discussion, I think, would following the life cycle of research be helped by implementing RAID to link all stages of the research through to final published versions?
It's a thought.
I'll hand over to anyone who wants to jump in.
It'd have to be, yeah, it's a great idea to explore. I couldn't give a definitive answer from my perspective right now. Yeah, I think that's a really imaginative suggestion.
I really like, some of that comment too, because I think to help authors and to bring the institution along so that everyone understands and knows how to make choices that suit them best in the open environment. I think taking a research life cycle approach is what's most helpful to the researchers and to the authors, as it explains it really like in their context.
Yeah, I think it can, it allows for, that early release of material, but then it actually can say, well, yes, that's a preprint now, this is the final version. The bit that I suspect may well not sit too well with the publishers is pre-releasing material, but who knows? That can be negotiated.
If I can perhaps one just to add to that, I think that what this really does play to is this idea of interoperability and the critical importance of metadata. So, RAID is just one of these, one of the many kind of identifiers that are critically important. We're now understanding how important they are, DOIs, ORCID IDs. And, in a way, one of the things that has really got us to this point right now is because we built the infrastructure so that we can support being open. 20 years ago, there was no ORCID, the DOIs were still relatively new. So the critical issue of having the infrastructure in place is becoming important. And this talks again to the need for governments to get on board, because you need support for this. As Andrew said, this stuff is not free. Even if however you support open research, it's not free. It requires infrastructure, it requires investment, not just of things, but of people. Come back to the UNESCO, one of the things that's very, very obviously missing is a trained workforce that can really support open research across the entire life cycle. So I think those kind of things absolutely have their place.
Are there more questions, Ben?
Yes, so another one here, and I think, again, we touched on it a bit earlier, but maybe we could circle back and get some more views. Someone's asked that they'd love to know the panel's thoughts on the NHMRC open access policy proposal.
Make a comment. So I've been involved in two submissions. There's the UNSW submission that we have done, where we're generally favourable of it. I personally am more favourable of the faster timeline option than the slower one. I don't think having that extra delay will add a lot of benefit myself. Also been involved working with Ginny, of course, because Open Access Australasia has also submitted on behalf of, I think, of members, and we're generally favourable there too. So.
Perhaps just to put it quickly in context, it's obviously the proposal from NHMRC is very much in alignment with what Coalition S is planning, or has already implemented, in fact, through Plan S, which came into started from the 1st of January this year. And I think I think what I find really interesting about the NHMRC proposal, in addition to the actual nuts and bolts of it, is that it is very much in alignment with what's happening globally. You know, we're seeing funders everywhere who are beginning to say this is the route that we want to go. And it will, I think, you know, it is undoubtedly going to propel us towards a more open future from publishers that have not been willing to participate. This is, you know, it is to some extent saying, well, this is our expectation for our research, so, you know, help us get there. And I think publishers doing it as a big group is actually very valuable. So not publishers, funders doing it as a big group. Greater funders, publishers are important parts of this, but the funders are the ones who are definitely driving things at the moment.
Okay, Ben, got time for another question?
Probably got time for one more. So this one references something that Andrew spoke about earlier, but could the panel please comment on the implications of the IP debates on COVID-19 vaccines for open access and open research? This is obviously touching on the WTO waiver of IP rights or protections for the development of vaccines and related aspects of the COVID vaccine.
I think all parties will be looking at this very closely to see what it ends up looking like and how the debate goes. But I come back to sort of just a reiteration of earlier observations about there needs to be proper funding to develop a vaccine. There needs to be proper funding to have a robust scholarly communications system, whether that funding comes direct from governments via or taxpayers via governments, or whether you do it through a more commercial model, will be a political choice ultimately, I guess. The NHMRC itself observes around patents that there is an expectation of a commercial outcome from research that leads to a new medicine or a new procedure or a piece of equipment that will improve health. And this goes back to Cynthia's point about CSIRO's position. It's looking to get the impact from its research and get through that, what do they call it, the valley of death between the end of the research and the sort of the research output, and then some sort of commercialized output that results in a bigger crop for a farmer or an improved environmental outcome or whatever it is. And I think that's the ultimate goal that we should be looking for. There needs to be some commercial component in there, I think, because of the imperative that commercial models through profit actually drive people to be clever.
Can I throw one thing in which will probably stir things up a little bit? There's and apologies. This was a fascinating preprint, so apologies for that. But basically showed that about 85% of the funding that supported the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, contrary to what was being claimed, actually was publicly funded. So, but there's a lot of people making a lot of money out of that vaccine. So, and that came out of a whole load of freedom of information requests that a bunch of researchers did. So it's a really complicated area. You know, I think, you know, how we unpick all of this. You're absolutely right, Andrew. There has to be some sort of payoff at the end of it, but who gets paid off is a really challenging question, I think.
And I think the WTO waiver and the Open COVID pledge come together to indicate that it's intellectual property is a key, you know, point that needs people, that COVID-19 has directed people to consider, and it needs further interrogation. It's an important area. Ben, are we out of time?
We are out of time, and I was just going to say, definitely will be really interesting to see what the US's change in stance on this, you know, means for the waiver going forward. I know that it was being debated today, I think, at the WTO or shortly. But thank you, everyone, for joining us to our panel, and for everyone joining us for your questions and comments. It was a really great discussion, so really appreciate everyone making the time. Ginny, Martin, Andrew, Cynthia, and Robin. thank you so much for hosting the session. We have one more webinar as part of the ADA forum this year that kicks off tomorrow at 1 p.m. And that's looking at the topic of what's next in copyright reform. So we're going to be looking at the implications for AI and text and data mining and those sorts of future technologies. So thanks everyone, and hope to see you at the last session tomorrow.
Thank you.
You.
Thanks.